Welcome. I'm Lisa Allen.
And I'm George Lucaci. You're watching Community Conversations, filmed from HTTV Studio in Summit, New Jersey.
On today's segment, we have the honor of welcoming award-winning photographer and multimedia journalist Tom Franklin. Among his many achievements, Tom is best known as the photographer who touched the hearts of millions when he captured the iconic photograph of the three firemen lifting the American flag after the attacks of 9/11. That famous image was later featured on a U.S. stamp called the Hero Stamp, which subsequently has helped raise $10 million for individuals affected by 9/11.
We are looking forward to learning more about Tom's illustrious career as a visual journalist and professor, and gain insight on his view of the future of journalism and media, and hear about his recent project governing the global refugee crisis. Thank you, Tom, for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for joining us. It's such an honor.
Cool.
You were a Pulitzer finalist in your photograph of the 9/11 firemen raising the flag. Tell us what that did for you and how that changed your life.
Well, that photograph has become a symbol of that tragic day. And you know what I frequently tell people is that we can't lose sight of the fact that thousands of people died that day, and that's what that photograph's about. It's about the people who look at the photograph and have a response that's mostly positive. And people to this day, I mean, how many years later are we now? And I still receive phone calls, letters, and emails from people telling me how much that photograph means to them, or if I could send them a copy or sign a copy that they have. And I think that is really powerful. I mean, it's powerful that a photograph, 20 years after the event is still resonating with people. And so when I look at that photograph, I think about the people who died that day and all the heroic efforts that people put forth trying to save others, and the countless people who gave of themselves that day.
Yeah. Well, and I think that you've covered a lot in your life. You've been in the news industry over 30 years. You were at the Record at the time that 9/11 happened. You've covered celebrities and you've done investigative journalism. Success does not happen by mistake. And I'm interested in finding out how you've transformed yourself over the last 30 years to not only stay relevant, but cover stories that are so touching for people's lives and have so much meaning.
Yeah, so, to be successful in journalism, it requires hard work. I mean, it requires getting your hands dirty, and it requires a variety of skills, from research to dogged persistence and having technical skills in your particular area. My particular area for many years was photography, and as a photojournalist, as I was on 9/11, my job was to go out and make pictures. So as hundreds, if not thousands of people were running to safety, I was running towards the danger. And that is the thing, with journalism, is that you're among the first responders. And, it's counterintuitive to run towards danger, but that's where the story was that day. As far as my career, in the mid-2000s, I decided that it was time to pivot a little bit in terms of the kind of work that I was doing, to transition more from photography to video. And so in the mid-2000s, as the digital era was starting to pick up, and newspapers like The Record that I was working for at the time were starting to build news websites, I started to produce videos. And for my last 10 years of working at that newspaper, I worked for the internet division, producing news pieces, both short form and long form. And although there's a lot of overlap between being a photojournalist, a still photographer photojournalist, and being a video photojournalist, they're really very different skill sets. And I think there's still a great need for still photography, but video is really where the traffic is now. People are consuming their news more and more on video and on digital devices like you have here.
Mm-hmm. It sounds like you're continuing to run towards danger in what you're doing right now as well, specifically with the refugee crisis. And I think you focused on that Syrian refugee crisis and the contiguous countries, specifically Greece, within that crisis.
Well, I left the newspaper business in 2015, and I started teaching full-time at Montclair State. And as a professor, I am expected to produce multimedia as I did in industry. And so I've chosen to focus on the topic of immigration and forced migration. So beginning in 2015, at that time, The center of the crisis really was coming from Syria, and the island of Lesbos, Greece, was where many refugees were coming to because they were trying to get to the European Union to seek asylum. And so in the middle of that crisis, I went to Lesbos and produced a number of stories. Typically, I was looking for local connections, so I always look for a New Jersey or New York, New Jersey angle. And one of the stories I was following when I was in Lesbos, actually in Athens, before I'd gotten to Lesbos, there was a refugee family from Syria that was living in an abandoned property. They were waiting for the European Union to decide on their asylum, and a nonprofit here in the States provided a service to connect donors in our area, in the U.S. with the refugees over in Greece. And so I found two sisters in New York City who were raising money for this particular family. And so I'm typically interested in the human aspects of storytelling and local connections. And so I spent some time with the family as they had moved out of an illegal dwelling into a formal apartment that was being paid for by these two sisters in New York who were connected through this organization called Human Wire.
Mm. You produced a video. It is called The World Arrived at Our Doorstep. And it is a really interesting contrast of what is really going on globally, that we have a mass migration crisis. 70 million refugees across the world are now homeless, essentially, because of war and poverty and persecution. And your video was such a touching contrast in the sense of the humanity of what the moral responsibility is for people to take in refugees, and you're going to talk about that because this is for Greece, versus when they get there, there are individuals who are afraid because those refugees are showing up and people feel that financially their system can't sustain them. And I think this is a real discussion that I loved how there's no vilification in your documentary, because we have to learn how to solve this really complex problem without vilifying each other. And the only thing that I feel will really solve it is empathy, which I felt was apparent in your video.
Well, thank you. So, so what that video is really about is about a British couple that was living on the island of Lesbos, and Lesbos is a small island very close to the Turkish coast. So it is the closest point to Turkey. So refugees who are trying to get to the European Union, all they need to do is step foot on land as part of the European Union to claim asylum. So this was the closest spot, so that's where people came. And this couple, Eric and Philippa Kempson, and they had been living a quiet life there. They lived right near the beach. They were artists. And all of a sudden, one day at the end of their driveway where there was a beach, refugees started showing up in these rubber dinghies. And 1, 2, 3 boats turned into hundreds a day. And this completely changed their lives. They decided that they needed to do something. So they put together a network of volunteers who would keep an eye out for boats. The boat crossings are very dangerous. Many people can't swim. The boats are overloaded. These are not vessels typically built to accommodate the numbers of people that were bringing over. So there were lots of drownings. There were insufficient life jackets. And what would typically happen when the boats arrived on the shore was very rocky. People would actually slip, fall, get hurt, and even drown right within close proximity to the shore. So the Kempsons formed this network of volunteers to keep an eye out for the boats. And here we are, we're like 5 years later, and I follow them on Facebook, and there are still, record numbers of refugees still arriving in Lesbos. And so the video focused on that. There was a villain of sorts in that story, which was the fact that local villagers in Greece, in Lesbos, Greece, were not happy that they were, many villagers felt like they were encouraging, refugees for coming to the island, which really is crazy. But nonetheless, they were vilified in their own village. I should point out too that the island of Lesbos has been extraordinary in their generosity and their willingness to help and extend themselves to refugees. But it's going on 6 years now, and there's I think there's something like 1 refugee for every 4 residents of the island. And they're living in prisons, and it's very bad conditions. They had the worst winter on record last year. People were dying of cold in these refugee camps. And look, I mean, the topic of forced migration and refugees is very complicated, right? Because nobody wants to leave their home, right? But they're being forced to leave their home. No matter what the reason is, they're still leaving their home, whether it's from Central America or it's in Southeast Asia or here in the Middle East. People are leaving their homes in record numbers.
Because they're forced
historic numbers,
right.
And so this puts pressure on the countries that are on the receiving end, including the United States. It's complicated issues. My work is not political, but I do try to shed light to create broader understanding so people can understand these complicated issues. The crisis is real, whether we want to, no matter which side of the political argument you're on, the crisis is real, and record numbers of people are leaving their homes in Europe, in Central America, at our southern border, and other places around the world.
It's funny that, well, it's not really funny, but the refugee crisis is really part of humanity. It's part of our human history. It goes back thousands of years. We've had this, whether it's World War II or, in the 1700s in Europe. What do you think that your takeaway was from the people who were embracing the refugees as opposed to the people who are afraid of the refugees?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. Every place where I did my reporting, so that was in Greece, in both Athens and Lesbos, and in the U.S. southern border in Tijuana and San Diego, and as well as central Mexico, everywhere I did reporting, there were extraordinary, effective and generous volunteer-based relief organizations, nonprofits, grassroots organizations of people trying to help. So the positive side, if you will, of this crisis is that people are helping, and people are giving of their time, and people are showing great levels of empathy to try and help. And government agencies, even the governments that are accepting refugees, aren't accepting enough of them, and there's still lots of these internment camps where refugees are living that are really bad conditions. I've visited a number of them, and these are not places that you want to live. We're talking about tents in muddy fields in the dead of winter, 15 people in a tent.
But it's still better than where they came from.
Well,
that's what's amazing to me.
Correct. But how long can you live in that environment? So I think, I think that this is a real crisis that needs to really be addressed, and we're really just putting Band-Aids on a much larger problem.
Well, I guess that begs the question, how do we solve this? I think it's a partnership between individuals, nonprofits, and governments. But is there a way to solve this? Do you see, in all your experience in travels, what you think will make it change for the better?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm not an expert in this area, but what I can say from what I saw and through my reporting is that the people who are leaving their homes and seeking a better life elsewhere are probably the people that are going to make the countries they're going to better places. Right? These are people who are showing extreme fortitude and a desire to have a better life. Right? And I mean, isn't that what all Americans seek, right? And so I would think, with a rigorous vetting process in place, I think countries, could benefit from, accepting more refugees from these places that people are fleeing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So you shined a spotlight on that specific refugee crisis in Syria. If you were to shine a light on your next mission of being a videographer, where would that be?
Well, I spent some time in March, this past March, at the U.S. southern border between Mexico and Tijuana, and I was only there for a week. I was, it was the middle of the school year. I was there for spring break, so I went for my spring break there to do reporting, and it was, a really intense couple of days of seeing what was going on there, and I spent a good amount of time on both sides. One of the things that I did witness was a group of migrants had created a breach in the border wall on the beach in Tijuana and had escaped right before my very camera, and with lots of people watching. And this was an area that was fairly fortified, right? There's a border wall that goes right out into the ocean that's made of metal pillars going into the ground. Beyond that, there's a fence, and beyond that, there's a barbed wire fence, and Custom Border Patrol patrols that area. And still people were finding openings and crevices and going through. So to answer your question, I think I'd like to go back to the U.S. southern border and explore that a little bit more, because there were great stories of not only from the migrant perspective, but also from the Border Patrol perspective. It was very hard to gain access to Border Patrol police. I tried, and they're kind of in the mode where they have their hands full. But I think the U.S. southern border is a real area of crisis right now. And what became apparent to me, and without really casting a political opinion about the matter, is that a border wall is not an answer, because there were many spots, without even really having to drive that far out of say San Diego, where you could just walk around the wall. I mean, in areas where you didn't walk around the wall, there are towns in the Mexico side that abut the wall. You could easily just get a ladder and just climb over the wall. I mean, so a wall is not really the answer. I think that's pretty apparent. Anybody who visits a border area along the U.S. southern border, I think, would come to the same conclusion. So I think a better process for receiving and handling and processing migrants is probably a better answer, and I'd probably look to do some reporting along those lines.
Well, and it's interesting that you say that, because I think to some degree it has to come from policy. So there is a political component to this, where we have to put pressure on legislators and people who can make those decisions to make sure the policies are adjusting for a 70 million migration, refugee crisis problem. I think it's 4 to 5 million refugees have left Venezuela. Right? Over 5 million individuals have left Syria, near 6 million. That's the size of Colorado.
Yeah.
I mean, imagine Colorado having a mass exodus. So I think that we don't want to be political, but at the same time, we have to still put pressure in the right places. So, I don't know.
We have to, in fact, I think what we have to do is set an example for the rest of the world. Whatever that example might be, with public-private partnerships, or how we accept these refugees, or how we don't accept the refugees, I think the United States is really almost obligated, in my opinion, to set an example for the rest of the world as to what we do with our crisis. And I'm not sure we're doing that now, but I hope to see us doing that.
I don't think we are really doing that right now, but I would agree that the United States is poised to receive refugees. Right? We have lots of immigrant communities, established immigrant communities in the United States. I mean, you look at Paterson, New Jersey, which is an area that I've done a lot of reporting on. I mean, there are ethnic enclaves from all over the world there, and these are the communities where where if refugees are brought into the country, they could adapt really well, as opposed to a country where nobody speaks the language and is familiar with the culture. In the United States, we're so diverse. We have familiarity with so many different cultures. Yeah. It's an obvious placement for refugees. But I understand refugees put pressure on governments, and it costs money, and it costs it takes organizations a lot of time to process them and place them in organizations where they could be successful. And it's complicated, but I don't think that the crisis is going anywhere. I think it's only going to continue to build. I mean, the war has just been escalated in Turkey and Syria in the last 2 weeks, right? And that's, what's that going to cause? Well, that's going to cause more displacement eventually. And, I don't think anybody sees any signs of the problem abating anytime soon.
Yeah. What's really sad to me is that, and tell me if you see this during your travels of visiting these refugee camps or the crisis itself, is that the front line for these wars that cause the refugees is women and children. They're the front line of all the suffering. And is that something that you focused on or have seen more than some of the other episodes that might occur?
Yeah, well, that's a great point. So that Syrian refugee family I was telling you about a few minutes ago that I had spent some time with in Athens, and they were being moved out of a shelter into an apartment. Well, they had 2 teenage girls. At the time, I believe they were 12 and 14. And by the time I had met them in 2016, they had been out of school for like 3 years, right? So think about that, right? So if you were to take away all learning and education and development, formal education, you know, three years in the early teens, well, that's going to set those two girls back significantly. You know, thankfully, they were given asylum in Germany, and they're going to school. And I recently talked to the dad, and the dad said they were doing quite well, and they were really happy that the girls had settled into school, and they were now able to try and pursue their dreams. One of the girls wants to be a pharmacist, and the dad said she's in a position to resume what she missed. But when I met them, they were all suffering from post-traumatic stress. I spent some time with refugees that had been settled in Elizabeth, New Jersey, for a story that I did, and the children in those families were definitely suffering from PSD, some more so than others, and that's that's a real thing, and that I don't know what assistance they're getting, when they're already having difficulty speaking the language and adapting to American culture and the way of life here. It's a lot.
So I don't want to forget that you also have a exhibit, right? Seeking Refuge. Do you want to talk about that?
Sure. So Seeking Refuge is a project that I've been working on for 5 years, some of which we've been discussing. But I explore different areas of the topic related to forced migration, from Greece to central Mexico, to the United States border between Mexico and California, as well as here in New Jersey. And I explore different aspects of immigration and refugee migration and seeking asylum, as well as assimilating within American society. And the exhibit was at Blair Academy a month ago, and I'm exploring other venues to exhibit the work, and I'm pretty excited about some possibilities that should be coming forward soon.
And if someone wants to go see an exhibit, how do they find you?
Well, you can go to my website, thomasfranklin.com. I'm not difficult to find online. You can find me, and or follow me on social media. I'm pretty active on all social media platforms, and I'll be posting some news about the next exhibit.
Okay.
So we can follow you on Twitter.
Yeah, Twitter, Tommy Fran, Facebook, Instagram,
Okay.
LinkedIn, yeah.
Great.
Well, I have a question, actually. What is one thing you want people to walk away with in terms of the refugee crisis? Is there anything you want a message for people out there?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, I think that here in the U.S., a lot of us have pretty nice lifestyles, and we're kind of at a distance from a lot of these problems, right? I know people in my town, the circles that they travel in, they're not exposed to people who are in the country undocumented. They're not exposed to people who speak different languages or even look different than them. So I think anytime you can spend time with people who are a little different than yourself, whose circumstances might be a little different than yours, I think empathy grows. And I think empathy is really the answer as much as anything. And I think, I certainly understand that these issues are complicated, but I think a greater sense of empathy would not only make people feel better about themselves, they'd probably help the crisis a lot. And I think, governments are showing a real lack of empathy, not just here in the U.S., but other countries as well.
Yeah. Empathy. Isn't that what basically is written on the Statue of Liberty?
Yeah.
And isn't that the message that we should probably give the world, or at least you revive that message or embolden that message a little bit?
Yeah. One of the cool things about being a journalist is that you do get to meet people from all different walks of life, and you get to learn about their stories, and it's a real privilege. It's a privilege to learn about them, even if their circumstances are, not so great. And it's really an honor to tell their stories. And one of the cool things about social media as well is that I've been able to stay in touch with a lot of people that I'm reporting on. And so I keep tabs on them, and I get a better sense of what the result is. And so that's a really nice aspect of what social media can provide. But yeah, I think it comes down to empathy as much as anything.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned the Statue of Liberty and empathy. You just took some Montclair students to see an immigration naturalization ceremony. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah,
That's really interesting.
So I teach at Montclair State. I teach multimedia. I teach in the area of journalism. I teach video storytelling as well as photojournalism. And for an in-class assignment in my photojournalism class, we went to the Great Falls in Patterson, where they had a naturalization ceremony. Right, they do it every year, and it's a wonderful setting because you have this magnificent waterfalls as a backdrop. And 40 new citizens were sworn in that day, and I brought a group of students. I think there were about 16 of our students, and we did an Instagram photo essay. Where students had to do reporting with taking photographs and gathering information. And it was a great assignment, and it was a great opportunity for them to apply some of the skills that we're teaching them, but also to kind of explore the areas in which I have great interest in. I should point out too that the trip that I made to Lesvos, Greece, was also a trip where we brought students. I had 2 other faculty members went, and a small group of students went and did their own reporting. And it's a nice opportunity for students to work concurrently with the professors.
Sounds like you got a lot of missions: teaching, exhibiting, traveling, and really exposing what's going on in this world. I think that's a pretty wonderful mission to have.
Yeah. Well, and you're raising up the next generation of communication students. I mean, just briefly, because we don't have a ton of time, but you know, in the era, you've been in this business, I said, over 30 years. You are now in a new era of, you know, fake news. Everybody's a citizen journalist because they have a phone.
Yeah.
What's the future of media?
Well, the future of media, I don't know. I don't have a crystal ball. It's hard to say. But
Darn, I was hoping that he had the answer.
You had your pencil up.
I know, I was ready.
But
You heard it here.
But this is a topic of discussion that that happens almost on a daily basis. What I am sure of is that storytelling is not going anywhere. Right? There is a desire that's as great as ever for information and for storytelling. And so, at Montclair State, we're teaching students to be modern day storytellers. And the medium in which they deliver their stories, well, that's going to constantly evolve, right? It's evolving as we speak. I told you how when I started in the business, I worked as a photojournalist. It was just print. And then it went mostly the way of digital, and I adapted. And I think that's a good example of how students have to approach journalism today, is that the medium and the delivery is going to always be changing. But the need for storytelling and the fundamentals for good storytelling will always be the same.
Be the same.
Well, it's been an honor to hear your story.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And the message I'm taking away is be adaptable.
Yeah, I think so. I think so.
All right.
A little empathy too.
Yeah. Great place to leave it.
Sure.
Right. Thank you. Thank you so much, Tom.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us today. We hope you enjoyed this segment. For more programming like this, check us out on our website, Facebook page, Instagram, and LinkedIn, listed at the bottom of our page. I'm Lisa Allen.
And I'm George Lucaci. Thank you for watching Community Conversation.